What if I told you that every time the Indian government borrows money, every time America prints new dollars, and every time you swipe your UPI card, you're all part of the same global loop of debt? Sounds impossible, right? Because we usually think of debt as something bad, a sign someone's run out of cash. But what if debt isn't weakness at all? What if it's the engine that keeps the world running? From Washington to Mumbai, from Tokyo to Delhi. Across the planet, governments are bellied in obligations. In Washington, public debt now towers over $38 trillion, the highest in US history. The European Union follows close behind at $14 trillion, while Japan's borrowings hover near $9 trillion. And it's not just the West. From Brazil to South Korea, from South Africa to Australia, every major economy runs on borrowed money. The irony? Wealth may be unevenly distributed, but debt is universal. And yes, India too. Our central and state governments together now owe roughly 180 lakh crore rupees, around 82% of GDP, double what it was 2 decades ago. So if everyone owes money, who exactly is owed? And more importantly, how does this system still work? This is Periscope, and today we're looking below the surface of numbers to understand why the world doesn't owe money to anyone in particular. It owes it to itself. Debt didn't start with banks or credit cards. It started with something much simpler: trust. Imagine an ancient marketplace. A craftsman borrows copper from his neighbor to make tools, promising to repay after his next sale. No letters, no coins, only a reputation. That simple exchange, sealed by faith instead of signatures, was the ancestor of modern credit. The first interest wasn't measured in numbers, it was measured in belief. As kingdoms grew, ambitions expanded. Rulers dreamed of fortresses, fleets, and empires, but the royal treasury could only stretch so far. Gold was scarce, battles were costly, and glory demanded more than the crown could mint. So they borrowed. In 1694, when England ran out of money during a war with France, the king turned to London's merchants. They pooled their funds and lent it to the crown, in return for steady interest payments backed by taxes. To manage it, they created the Bank of England. For the first time, a government could spend money it didn't yet have. That was the birth of the government bond, the seed of modern finance. France copied it, the Dutch refined it, and soon the idea crossed the Atlantic, funding America's revolution and expansion westward. Debt stopped being a mark of desperation. It became a sign of credibility. If you could borrow, it meant others trusted your future. By the 20th century, national debt had become the bloodstream of modern states. Wars were fought on credit. Cities were rebuilt on borrowed money. After World War II, 44 countries met at Bretton Woods. They decided the US dollar would sit at the center of global finance. Every currency was pegged to the dollar, and the dollar was pegged to gold. But there was one problem. Economies grow faster than gold mines. As America spent more on Vietnam, on welfare, on the space race, there simply wasn't enough gold to back all those dollars. That's Griffin's dilemma. The paradox where the nation issuing the world's reserve currency must keep running deficits to provide liquidity, but by doing so, it slowly erodes confidence in its own money. So in 1971, President Nixon ended the gold standard. And just like that, the world entered the era of fiat money, currency backed by nothing but trust. From that moment on, countries could borrow freely. They could print, spend, and promise their way to growth. And they did. By the 1980s, global debt exploded. Not from war, but because borrowing had become the shortcut to prosperity. You could borrow to build highways, power plants, schools, even borrow your way out of a recession. Debt became the oxygen of progress. And soon, it became normal. When India became independent in 1947, we started with almost nothing. Low industry, few exports, barely any foreign exchange. So from our very first 5-year plans, borrowing became part of the national strategy. We borrowed from the World Bank and the IMF to build dams, steel plants, and later, roads, railways, and telecom networks. By the 1980s, our debt to GDP ratio had crossed 50%. Then came the 1991 crisis. India had only enough dollars to pay for 2 weeks of imports. We mortgaged our gold to the Bank of England and borrowed emergency funds from the IMF. That moment changed everything. It forced India to liberalize, open markets, reduce restrictions, invite private capital. Ironically, it was debt that gave birth to reform. Since then, our debt hasn't vanished. It's evolved. Today, the biggest buyers of Indian government bonds aren't foreigners. They're Indian institutions, banks, insurers, pension funds. In a strange way, India now owes money mostly to itself, just like the United States. Here's where the story gets interesting. When you deposit your salary in a bank, it doesn't just sit there. The bank takes that money and lends it out to businesses, to home buyers, and yes, to the government. The Reserve Bank of India issues government securities, basically IOUs that promise a fixed return. Banks, mutual funds, insurance companies, they all buy those bonds. And when the government pays interest, that money flows right back into those same institutions, into your savings account, your pension fund, your mutual fund portfolio. So India borrows from Indians, spends on Indians, and pays Indians back, using taxes collected from Indians. It's a loop, a circular mirror. Now, zoom out. At the global level, the same pattern repeats. The US borrows from Japan and Europe. Europe lends to developing nations. Developing nations park their reserves back in US treasuries. Everyone owes someone. And yet, everyone's part of the same machine. It's a worldwide chain of trust, held together by one belief: that tomorrow will be richer than today. But here's the thing. The entire system runs on confidence. As long as investors believe governments will keep paying interest, even if they never repay the full amount, the machine keeps humming. But once that belief cracks, everything starts shaking. Remember Greece 2010? Investors suddenly lost faith in the Greek government. Interest rates skyrocketed overnight. The country went bankrupt. Unemployment crossed 25%. And the word austerity became part of everyone's vocabulary. India's never seen a collapse like that. But we've come close. Every time the rupee weakens or inflation spikes, our borrowing costs jump. If foreign investors lose confidence, the pressure multiplies instantly. The rupee slides, imports get expensive, and growth slows. And it's not just nations. Even Indian states, Punjab, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, spend more than they earn. They depend heavily on bonds to pay salaries and fund welfare schemes. For every 100 rupees the government spends today, around 20 rupees goes just to pay interest on past loans. That's the price of the loop. When we say printing money, most people imagine a mint spitting out paper notes. But that's not how modern debt is created. Today, it begins with a keystroke. Every time a central bank, like the RBI or the Federal Reserve, buys government bonds, it credits the seller's account with newly created digital money. That money didn't exist a second ago. It's created out of thin air, backed only by the government's promise to repay someday. In other words, every rupee or dollar in circulation is someone else's debt. Your savings, your mutual funds, your pension, they're all made of government IOUs. And the world runs on that trust. The US issues bonds. Global investors buy them. The dollars that flow out become reserves in other countries, including India's. India then uses those reserves to buy oil, pay for imports, and stabilize the rupee. Every country's balance sheet is stitched into another's. No one stands alone anymore. That's why when the US Federal Reserve raises interest rates, India's borrowing costs rise too. When China slows down, commodity prices fall, and African exporters struggle. The web is so tightly woven that the difference between local and global debt barely exists. It's the same ocean, just with different tides. So, if governments keep borrowing endlessly, how do they ever pay it back? The truth is, they don't. They just borrow new money to pay the old. Sounds reckless, right? But it's actually official policy now. Economists call it refinancing. Old bonds mature, new ones replace them. The cycle repeats. And it works because investors aren't waiting to get their money back. They're waiting for the next bond to buy. A US Treasury, a Japanese government bond, or an Indian GSEC. They're not seen as liabilities anymore. They're seen as safe assets. Banks use them as collateral. Pension funds treat them like guaranteed income. Central banks hold them as reserves. If the US suddenly decided to pay off all $38 trillion it owes, global markets would collapse overnight, because the world would lose its most trusted asset. The dollar supply would shrink, credit would dry up, and the financial system, which survives on constant motion, would suffocate. Debt, in a strange way, isn't the poison, it's the pulse, the heartbeat of capitalism. That's why when politicians say they'll eliminate national debt, it's mostly theater. The real goal isn't to pay it off. It's to keep it sustainable, believable, and circulating. But what happens when belief fades? When people stop trusting that tomorrow will be richer than today? History has a few warnings. In Argentina, repeated defaults turned debt into a national curse. In Sri Lanka, a dollar shortage in 2022 triggered fuel lines, power cuts, and street protests. In Venezuela, hyperinflation wiped out entire life savings. And in Greece, the bailout came with a lost generation of jobs. Every crisis begins the same way. Confidence breaks. Borrowing costs skyrocket, and governments face an impossible choice. Print more money, raise taxes, or default. India isn't immune either. Every few years, we flirt with the edges of that storm. When oil prices spike, when the rupee weakens, or when fiscal deficits widen. The difference? Most of India's debt is still held domestically by our own banks, insurers, and citizens. That makes us a bit more resilient, for now. But as we borrow more to fund infrastructure, defense, and welfare, we walk a very fine line between growth and dependence. Because confidence is like oxygen. You don't notice it until it starts to run out. There's another truth we don't talk about enough. When economists say we owe it to ourselves, it sounds harmless, like a family borrowing from within. But in reality, that we isn't equal. debt moves money upward. The taxpayers who fund the interest payments are mostly workers and consumers. The ones who receive those payments are investors, banks, and large funds. That's why inequality and indebtedness rise together. The system rewards those who own debt and burdens those who serve it. Think about it. When the government pays interest on bonds, that money rarely reaches the poor. It flows to the top, into mutual funds, pension portfolios, or foreign institutions. Debt isn't just an economic tool, it's a mirror of power. And you can see that imbalance right here in India. Large corporations can borrow billions at 8%. Small businesses pay 14%. The government can issue sovereign bonds anytime. An ordinary citizen struggles to get a 10 lakh rupee loan. The ladder of credit always tilts upward. It's a fragile world from falling apart. Just belief. Belief that governments will honor their interest payments. Belief that inflation will stay under control. Belief that tomorrow's economy will be big enough to pay for today's promises. It's a system built not on gold, not even on productivity, but on confidence. Confidence that paper promises will hold their value. That's why central banks obsess over words like stability and credibility. Because once faith cracks, no amount of money printing can fix it. And when that happens, investors rush toward what feels real. The world doesn't owe money to anyone in particular. It owes it to belief itself. And belief, as history shows, is the most valuable and the most fragile currency of all. For India, that trust is both an opportunity and a warning. An opportunity to build responsibly through smart borrowing. A warning that if faith in our fiscal discipline fades, even a $1 trillion dream can unravel overnight. Because the global economy isn't built on money, it's built on motion. And motion only lasts as long as people believe in the story that keeps it moving. If this episode gave you a new way to see the world, make sure to subscribe to Periscope. Here, we decode the hidden systems shaping India and the global economy. Because understanding how money really works isn't just about finance. It's about seeing power clearly. And at Periscope, that's exactly what we do.